Hi, I'm Sarah. They called me the family disappointment, while they clawed over Grandma's old jewelry like vultures. Uncle Robert actually yanked a tarnished bracelet from Aunt Linda's hands and declared, "She promised this to me!" But when I revealed the Swiss bank account containing $8 million that Grandma had secretly left to me, their greedy faces went white as the funeral flowers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that Grandma had been watching their true colors for years, and she had planned the most beautiful justice I've ever witnessed. The morning of Grandma Maggie's funeral dawned gray and drizzling in Portland, Oregon, as if the sky itself was mourning the loss of the most genuine person I'd ever known. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple black dress I'd bought at Target, knowing it would be judged by family members who measured worth in designer labels and bank account balances. My reflection stared back at me, brown hair pulled into a modest bun, makeup minimal, looking every bit the part of what my family had always seen me as, the unsuccessful granddaughter who never quite measured up. At 28, I was the black sheep of the Thompson family. While my cousins Michael and Jessica had pursued business degrees and landed corporate jobs, I had chosen to become a social worker, dedicating my life to helping children in foster care. The family never missed an opportunity to remind me that my annual salary was less than what they spent on their vacation homes. Uncle Robert, Grandma's eldest son, had made it particularly clear over the years that he considered my career choice both naive and financially irresponsible. My phone buzzed with a text from my partner Alex, who was already at work at the veterinary clinic. "Thinking of you today. Your grandmother would be proud of who you've become. Don't let them make you feel otherwise." I smiled sadly, wishing Alex could be there with me, but someone had to cover the emergency calls, and we both knew the family gathering would be tense enough without introducing my relationship to relatives who had barely acknowledged my existence for the past decade. The drive to Riverside Memorial Chapel took me through the southeast Portland neighborhood where Grandma Maggie had lived for 43 years. Her modest two-story house sat on Maple Street, with its small front garden that she had tended with such care, growing tomatoes and roses side by side. I had spent countless afternoons there as a child, learning to bake her famous chocolate chip cookies and listening to stories about her youth during World War II. She had immigrated from Switzerland as a young woman, marrying my grandfather William Thompson in 1952, and had always spoken fondly of her homeland, though she rarely talked about the family she had left behind. The funeral home parking lot was already filling with luxury vehicles when I arrived in my 10-year-old Honda Civic. Uncle Robert's black Mercedes sat prominently near the entrance, while Aunt Linda's white BMW was parked at an angle that took up 2 spaces, typical of her assumption that rules didn't apply to her. I could see Cousin Michael's red Porsche and Jessica's silver Lexus gleaming in the weak morning sunlight, a stark contrast to the handful of modest cars belonging to Grandma's actual friends from the senior center and her church. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was already thick with tension disguised as grief. Uncle Robert, a stocky man in his early 60s with thinning gray hair and an expensive suit, was holding court near the casket, accepting condolences with the practiced air of someone who enjoyed being the center of attention. Aunt Linda, his younger sister, stood nearby in a black Chanel dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her bleached blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Her eyes were dry, but she dabbed at them occasionally with a lace handkerchief for effect. Cousin Michael, Robert's son, had positioned himself strategically near the guest book, making sure to greet every arrival with his practiced corporate smile. At 32, he worked for a tech company in downtown Portland and never let anyone forget about his 6-figure salary or his downtown condo. His sister Jessica, 29 and a real estate agent specializing in luxury homes, was circulating through the small crowd, her voice carrying just a bit too loudly as she discussed property values and market trends with anyone who would listen. I approached the casket quietly, my heart heavy with genuine grief. Grandma Maggie looked peaceful in the simple blue dress she had requested, her gray hair styled the way she had worn it for decades, soft and natural. Her hands were folded over a small bouquet of roses from her own garden, which I had cut that morning and brought to the funeral director. In her fingers was the simple gold wedding band she had worn for 68 years, never removing it even after Grandpa William's death 15 years ago. "She looks good, doesn't she?" The voice behind me belonged to Mrs. Helen Parker, Grandma's closest friend from the senior center. Helen was 81, with silver hair and kind blue eyes that had always seen more than people realized. She had been Grandma's bridge partner for over 20 years, and the two women had shared countless afternoons playing cards and sharing stories over tea. "She does," I agreed, my voice catching slightly. "She looks like she's just sleeping." Helen squeezed my arm gently. "Your grandmother talked about you all the time, dear. She was so proud of the work you do with those children. She used to say you were the only one in the family who understood what really mattered." Before I could respond, Uncle Robert's voice boomed across the chapel. "Sarah! There you are. We need to discuss the arrangements after the service. There are things to be sorted out." I turned to see him approaching with his characteristic swagger, his expression already shifting into what I recognized as his business mode. Behind him, Aunt Linda and my cousins were watching with the intensity of predators sizing up prey. This was the moment I had been dreading, when the family's true priorities would be revealed in the aftermath of Grandma's passing. "Uncle Robert," I said simply, offering a small nod. "The service hasn't even started yet." I know," he replied, waving a dismissive hand. "But we all know how these things go. Emotions run high, and it's better to have everything organized beforehand. Your grandmother, God rest her soul, wasn't exactly what you'd call organized when it came to her affairs." Aunt Linda had materialized beside us, her sharp features arranged in what she probably thought was a sympathetic expression. "Sarah, honey, we're just trying to make sure everything is handled properly. You know how Mama was. Sweet as pie, but not very practical about money matters." The casual dismissal of Grandma's intelligence made my jaw clench, but I forced myself to remain calm. These people had no idea who Margaret Thompson really was, despite being her children and grandchildren. They saw only what they wanted to see: an elderly woman living in a modest house, driving an old car, shopping at discount stores. They had never bothered to look deeper, to understand the quiet strength and careful planning that had defined her entire life. "Perhaps we should focus on honoring her memory today," I suggested, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Michael stepped forward, his expression serious in the way he had perfected for important business meetings. "Sarah, we all want to honor her memory, but there are practical matters that need to be addressed. The house, her belongings, the small amount she had in savings. It all needs to be handled efficiently and fairly." The word "fairly" coming from Michael's mouth was particularly galling, considering he had visited Grandma exactly 3 times in the past 5 years, and only then when he needed money for various ventures that never seemed to pan out. I had been the one who drove her to doctor's appointments, helped her with grocery shopping, and spent every Sunday afternoon listening to her stories and sharing meals. Jessica joined our growing circle, her voice pitched at the perfect level of concern. "We're not trying to be insensitive, Sarah. It's just that some of us have more experience with financial matters and estate planning. We want to make sure everything is done legally and properly." The implication was clear. They considered me too naive and financially unsophisticated to handle any meaningful decisions about Grandma's estate. What they didn't know was that Grandma and I had spent many long conversations discussing exactly this scenario, and she had shared with me her deep disappointment in how materialistic and self-centered her family had become. Mrs. Helen Parker, who had been listening to this exchange with growing indignation, stepped closer to me. "Perhaps this conversation would be more appropriate after we've said goodbye to Margaret properly," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through enough family drama to recognize it when she saw it. Uncle Robert's eyes narrowed slightly at being challenged by someone he considered an outsider. But before he could respond, the funeral director appeared to announce that the service was about to begin. The family reluctantly took their seats in the front row, with me positioned at the end, slightly separated from the main group, a seating arrangement that perfectly reflected my status in their eyes. The service was beautiful and dignified, exactly what Grandma would have wanted. Pastor Williams from her church spoke about her decades of volunteer work, her quiet generosity, and her unwavering faith. Several of her friends from the senior center shared memories of her kindness and humor. I had prepared a brief eulogy, focusing on her love of gardening, her incredible chocolate chip cookies, and the way she had taught me that true wealth came from the relationships we build and the lives we touch. But even during the service, I could feel the restless energy from my family members, their minds clearly focused on what would come after. Uncle Robert checked his phone twice, and Aunt Linda kept glancing at her watch. Michael and Jessica whispered to each other during the closing prayer, their conversation undoubtedly centered on practical matters, rather than grief or remembrance. After the graveside ceremony, the family gathered in the parking lot of Riverside Memorial Chapel, the pretense of mourning quickly giving way to more pressing concerns. The gray Portland sky had opened up into a steady drizzle, creating an appropriately gloomy backdrop for what was about to unfold. "All right," Uncle Robert announced, pulling out his phone to check the time. "We need to get this sorted out today. I've made arrangements to meet with David Martinez, her attorney, at 2 o'clock. That gives us about 3 hours to go through the house and make sure we understand what we're dealing with." Aunt Linda nodded emphatically. "I called the bank this morning. Her checking account has about $8,000, and there's maybe another $4,000 in that old savings account she never touched. Plus, whatever equity is in the house, though honestly, that neighborhood has seen better days." The casual way they discussed Grandma's finances, as if she had been nothing more than a collection of assets to be divided, made my stomach turn. These were the same people who had barely acknowledged her existence when she was alive, who had been too busy with their successful careers and social lives to spend time with an elderly woman who would have treasured their company. Michael pulled up a calculator app on his phone, his expression serious as he began running numbers. "The house is probably worth about $250,000, maybe $275 if we're lucky. After we pay for the funeral expenses and any outstanding bills, we're burros, probably looking at dividing up around $260,000, plus whatever personal items have any value." Jessica was already scanning the parking lot, probably calculating the cost of everyone's vehicles and what that might indicate about their need for inheritance money. "We should catalog everything in the house systematically. I can handle the jewelry and any antiques. I have experience appraising estate items for my real estate clients. What about you, Sarah?" Uncle Robert asked, his tone suggesting he was being generous by including me in the conversation at all. "I know you probably need the money more than the rest of us, given your career choice." The condescending way he said career choice made it clear he still considered my work in social services to be some kind of extended hobby rather than a meaningful profession. What he didn't know was that I had recently been promoted to supervisor of the county's foster care program, a position that came with both increased responsibility and a significant salary improvement that finally allowed me to feel financially secure. "I think we should wait to hear what Mr. Martinez has to say," I replied carefully. Grandma may have left specific instructions about how she wanted things handled. Aunt Linda laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the gentle patter of rain on the chapel's roof. "Oh, honey, your grandmother was sweet, but she wasn't exactly sophisticated about legal matters. I doubt she had much more than a basic will, if that. Most people her age just assume their children will figure everything out." The dismissive way she spoke about Grandma's intelligence and planning capabilities revealed just how little any of them had truly known the woman they were now preparing to memorialize with dollar signs. Grandma Maggie had been many things, but unsophisticated was definitely not one of them. She had managed household finances for over 60 years, had successfully invested the life insurance money from Grandpa's death, and had always been extremely private about her financial affairs. Mrs. Helen Parker, who had been standing quietly nearby, approached our group with a determined expression. "I think you might be surprised by what Margaret had planned," she said, her voice carrying a note of warning that none of them seemed to catch. "She was much more organized than you give her credit for." Uncle Robert barely glanced at her, clearly considering her opinion irrelevant to family business. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. We appreciate your friendship with our mother, but these are private family matters." Helen's eyes flashed with anger at the dismissal, but she simply nodded at me and walked toward her car. As she passed, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Your grandmother was a very wise woman, dear. Trust in that." The drive to Grandma's house took us through the neighborhood I had known since childhood, past the corner market where she had shopped for groceries, the library where she had volunteered reading to children, and the small park where she had taken me to feed ducks when I was young. Every familiar landmark felt heavy with memory and loss, but also with something else, a growing sense of anticipation that I couldn't quite name. Grandma's house looked smaller than usual in the gray afternoon light, its blue paint slightly faded but still cheerful, the front garden showing the first signs of spring growth. Uncle Robert used the key that Grandma had given him years ago for emergencies, and we filed into the living room that still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume and the lemon oil she used on her furniture. The modest interior sparked immediate commentary from my family members. Aunt Linda ran her fingers along the dated furniture, clearly calculating whether any of it was worth keeping. Michael examined the old television and stereo system with barely concealed disdain, while Jessica took photos of the artwork and decorative items, probably for later research into their potential value. "This is going to take forever if we go through everything piece by piece, Uncle," Robert announced, surveying the decades of accumulated belongings. "I suggest we focus on anything that might have actual monetary value: jewelry, important papers, any collectibles or antiques." They moved through Grandma's home like a well-organized search team, opening drawers and cabinets with an efficiency that felt almost clinical. I found myself defending her privacy even in death, wanting to tell them to slow down, to show some respect for the life that had been lived within these walls. But I also found myself curious about what they would find, knowing that Grandma had always been more complex than any of them had realized. In her bedroom, Jessica discovered a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to Grandma's mother back in Switzerland. Inside were modest pieces: her wedding ring, a pearl necklace that had been an anniversary gift, a few brooches and earrings that reflected her simple but elegant taste. Nothing that would be considered valuable by current standards, but each piece carried memories and history that my family members seemed completely oblivious to. "This is all costume jewelry except for the wedding ring," Jessica announced after a quick examination. "Maybe worth a few $100s total. I'll handle selling it and we can split the proceeds." The casual way she dismissed items that had been precious to Grandma made me want to speak up, but I held my tongue. There would be time later to ensure that her belongings were treated with the respect they deserved. Uncle Robert had focused his attention on Grandma's small home office, going through file cabinets and desk drawers with the thoroughness of an auditor. He emerged with a small stack of papers: bank statements, insurance policies, the deed to the house, and what appeared to be a simple will dated 3 years earlier. "Just as I thought," he said, scanning the documents quickly. "Everything is pretty straightforward. The house goes to be divided among her children, which means Linda and me. The small amount in her accounts gets split the same way. There are a few small bequests to the church, and that senior center where she played cards, and $1,000 to Sarah for being such a loving granddaughter." The amount stung, not because I had expected more, but because it seemed to confirm their view of my place in the family hierarchy. $1,000 felt like being acknowledged but not truly valued, appreciated but not considered essential. Aunt Linda looked up from the kitchen, where she had been examining Grandma's collection of vintage mixing bowls and cooking utensils. "Well, that's settled then. We can put the house on the market next week, divide everything up and close this chapter." It's what Mama would have wanted, simple and efficient. As they continued their systematic inventory of Grandma's possessions, I found myself drawn to the small photograph albums scattered throughout the house. Unlike the expensive items my family was cataloging, these held the real treasures: decades of family photos, handwritten letters, and mementos from a life well lived. I picked up one album and began leafing through it, seeing pictures of Grandma as a young woman, photos of family gatherings from when I was a child, vacation snapshots that showed her genuine joy in simple pleasures. Tucked between the pages of one album, I found a small envelope with my name written on it in Grandma's distinctive handwriting. My heart skipped as I recognized her careful script, and I slipped the envelope into my purse before anyone could notice. Whatever it contained, I knew it was meant for me alone, and I wasn't ready to share it with family members who had already proven they saw everything in terms of monetary value. The afternoon wore on as my family continued their methodical assessment of Grandma's belongings. By 1:30, they had compiled a comprehensive list of everything they considered worth dividing, from furniture to kitchen appliances to the few pieces of artwork she had collected over the years. The total value of her worldly possessions, according to their pawn calculations, came to approximately $15,000 beyond the house itself. "All right," Uncle Robert announced, checking his watch. "Time to head over to the lawyer's office and make this official. Sarah, you're welcome to ride with us, though I suppose there's not much for you to do there except sign whatever paperwork acknowledges your bequest." I declined their offer, preferring to drive myself and maintain some independence in what was already feeling like a process designed to minimize my involvement. As I walked to my car, I could feel the envelope in my purse, its presence both comforting and mysterious. Whatever Grandma had wanted to tell me privately, I would read it when I was alone, away from the calculating eyes of family members who had already proven they didn't understand the woman who had raised them. The law office of David Martinez was located in a renovated Victorian house in the Pearl District, its warm, wooden interiors and comfortable furnishings creating an atmosphere that felt more like a living room than a place of business. Mr. Martinez himself was a man in his 50s, with graying temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the type of attorney who specialized in estate planning and family law with a focus on compassion rather than aggression. He greeted us in his conference room, expressing genuine condolences for our loss and sharing a brief story about how much he had enjoyed working with Grandma over the years. His comments about her intelligence and careful planning earned dismissive looks from my family members, who clearly considered such praise to be the kind of polite exaggeration lawyers used when discussing elderly clients. Before we begin with the formal reading, Mr. Martinez said, settling behind his desk with a thick file, "I want to make sure everyone understands that Margaret was extremely thorough in her estate planning. She spent considerable time over the past few years ensuring that her wishes would be carried out exactly as she intended." Uncle Robert shifted impatiently in his chair. "Of course, David, we appreciate your thoroughness, but we've already found her will in the house. It seems pretty straightforward. House and accounts divided between Linda and me, with small bequests to Charity and Sarah." Mr. Martinez's expression grew slightly puzzled. "I'm not sure which document you found, Robert, but Margaret's actual will is quite different from what you've described. Her estate planning involved several documents and financial instruments that she kept very private, even from family members." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Aunt Linda leaned forward, her voice taking on the sharp edge it acquired when she felt her expectations being challenged. "What do you mean, different?" "We found a will dated 3 years ago in her desk drawer. That document was a preliminary draft," Mr. Martinez explained gently. "Margaret asked me to prepare it while she was still considering various options, but her final will was executed just 6 months ago and includes significantly different provisions." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as my family members processed this information. Michael pulled out his phone, probably calculating how much money might be at stake if their assumptions had been wrong. Jessica's real estate agent instincts kicked in, and she began asking pointed questions about property valuations and asset distribution. But I found myself thinking about Grandma's knowing smile during our last conversation, when she had squeezed my hand and told me that everything would work out exactly as it should. She had been planning something all along, something none of us had suspected, and I was about to discover what 28 years of being the family disappointment had actually meant to the woman who had loved me unconditionally. Mr. Martinez opened the thick file and withdrew several documents, his expression professional but warm as he prepared to honor the final wishes of a woman who had clearly thought very carefully about the legacy she wanted to leave behind. Mr. Martinez cleared his throat and began reading from the official document, his voice steady and professional. "I, Margaret Elizabeth Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils and declare this to be my last will and testament." The familiar legal language filled the conference room, but I could sense the growing tension from my family members as they waited for the specific bequests that would determine their financial futures. "To my son Robert Thompson, I leave my collection of gardening tools and the sum of $5,000, with the hope that he will finally learn to nurture something besides his own ego. Uncle Robert's face flushed red at the pointed comment embedded in what should have been a straightforward bequest. Aunt Linda shot him a worried glance, clearly recognizing that this was not the substantial inheritance they had been expecting. Mr. Martinez continued without pause. To my daughter Linda Hayes, I leave my china cabinet and its contents, along with $5,000, trusting that she will find more value in family memories than in their potential resale price. Aunt Linda's mouth dropped open, her carefully applied lipstick suddenly looking garish against her pale face. $10,000 total to her 2 children was not what anyone in the room had anticipated. To my grandson Michael Thompson, I leave my collection of books and the sum of $2,000, hoping that he will finally read something that doesn't have a dollar sign attached to it. To my granddaughter Jessica Hayes, I leave my sewing machine and craft supplies along with $2,000, with the wish that she might create something meaningful instead of just acquiring it. The atmosphere in the conference room had shifted from expectant to shocked. Michael was staring at his phone as if the numbers might change if he looked at them differently. Jessica had gone completely still, her real estate agent composure cracking as she processed the reality that her inheritance was a fraction of what she had counted on. The remainder of my estate, Mr. Martinez continued, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, including all bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and personal property not otherwise specified, I leave entirely to my granddaughter Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, who has shown me more love and genuine care in the past 5 years than the rest of my family combined in the previous 20. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room, my heart pounding so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. Uncle Robert was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual commanding tone. "That can't be right," he said, shaking his head vigorously. "There must be some mistake. The will we found in her house clearly stated that Linda and I were to inherit the bulk of the estate." Mr. Martinez set down the document and folded his hands patiently. "As I mentioned, that was a preliminary draft from 3 years ago. Margaret came to see me regularly over the past 18 months to finalize her wishes. She was very specific about her reasoning and very firm in her decisions." Aunt Linda had gone from pale to flushed, her voice rising with each word. "This is ridiculous! Sarah is just a social worker. She doesn't need that kind of money, and frankly, she wouldn't know what to do with it. Mother must have been confused or manipulated somehow." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The suggestion that I had somehow influenced Grandma for financial gain was so far from the truth that I felt physically sick. Mr. Martinez's expression hardened slightly, his professional demeanor taking on a protective edge. "Mrs. Hayes, I can assure you that your mother was completely lucid and decisive throughout our meetings. In fact, she anticipated that there might be questions about her mental capacity, so she arranged for a complete psychological evaluation 6 months ago." Dr. Patricia Wells of Vedam Thais, respected geriatric psychiatrist, found Margaret to be of completely sound mind and fully capable of making informed decisions about her estate. Michael leaned forward, his corporate negotiation skills kicking in despite his obvious shock. "Mr. Martinez, with all due respect, we're talking about what was supposed to be a simple estate division. My grandmother lived modestly, drove an old car, and shopped at discount stores. How significant could this inheritance actually be?" Mr. Martinez opened another folder and withdrew a thick stack of financial documents. "Margaret's estate is valued at approximately $2 million, not including the house and personal property." The number hit the room like a physical blow. Aunt Linda actually gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she were having trouble breathing. Uncle Robert's face had gone from red to ashen gray, and he was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. Michael and Jessica sat frozen, staring at the lawyer as if he had spoken in a foreign language. I felt dizzy, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. $3.2 million. The number seemed impossible, fantastical. Grandma Maggie, who had clipped coupons and bought generic groceries, who had worn the same winter coat for 15 years, who had apologized for giving me only $20 for Christmas because times were tight, had been sitting on millions of dollars. "That's impossible," Uncle Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where would she have gotten that kind of money? Dad's life insurance was maybe $50,000, and they never made big salaries." Mr. Martinez nodded, clearly expecting this question. Margaret was extremely private about her financial affairs, as was her right. However, I can tell you that the majority of her wealth came from careful investments over many decades, along with an inheritance she received from her family in Switzerland that she never disclosed to anyone except me and Sarah. The mention of Switzerland sent another shock through the room. I remembered Grandma's stories about her homeland, her occasional comments about family members she had left behind, but she had never mentioned any inheritance or ongoing financial connections to Europe. "Switzerland?" Aunt Linda's voice had risen to nearly a shriek. "What inheritance from Switzerland? Mother never mentioned any Swiss family money." "Because she chose not to," Mr. Martinez replied calmly. "Margaret received notification 12 years ago that she was the beneficiary of her late brother's estate. He had been quite successful in the banking industry and had never married. The inheritance was substantial, and Margaret invested it wisely with the help of financial advisors I recommended." Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out shaky and uncertain. 12 years ago. She's been wealthy for 12 years and never told us? Never spent any of it? Never helped any of us when we had financial difficulties?" The accusation in her voice was unmistakable, but Mr. Martinez's response was swift and firm. Margaret was under no obligation to disclose her private financial affairs to anyone. She chose to live modestly because that was her preference, not because she lacked resources. As for helping family members with financial difficulties, she told me that none of you had ever actually asked for help, only made comments about how difficult things were, while continuing to live quite comfortably. Uncle Robert was slowly shaking his head, as if trying to wake up from a bad dream. "This doesn't make sense. If she had that kind of money, why live in that little house? Why drive that old car? Why worry about grocery prices?" "Because those habits brought her joy and kept her connected to her values," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the reading began. Everyone turned to look at me, and I realized that some part of me had always known there was more to Grandma's story than she had shared. She used to tell me that money was a tool, not a goal. She lived the way she wanted to live, not the way wealthy people were supposed to live. Mr. Martinez smiled at me with genuine warmth. "Your grandmother said you would understand. That's actually why she chose to leave everything to you, Sarah. In her words, you were the only family member who valued her for who she was, rather than what she might be able to provide." Aunt Linda's composure finally cracked completely. "This is insane. Sarah spent time with her because she didn't have anything better to do. No real career, no family of her own, no social life. Of course she had time to visit an old woman and listen to boring stories." The cruelty of her words hit me like a slap, but before I could respond, Mr. Martinez intervened with ice in his voice. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm going to ask you to show some respect for your mother's memory and her clearly stated wishes." Sarah visited Margaret regularly, not because she had nothing better to do, but because she genuinely cared about her grandmother's well-being. He turned back to his documents, his professional mask firmly in place despite the obvious tension in the room. "There are a few additional provisions I need to share. Margaret established a trust fund for any future great-grandchildren's education, to be administered by Sarah. She also set aside $50,000 for Mrs. Helen Parker, her dear friend, along with specific instructions for the care of her garden." Michael was frantically taking notes on his phone, probably trying to calculate if there were any legal grounds for contesting the will. "Mr. Martinez, we're going to need time to process this information. Are there any waiting periods or contest provisions we should be aware of?" "The will includes a no-contest clause," Mr. Martinez replied matter-of-factly. "Any beneficiary who challenges the will automatically forfeits their inheritance entirely." Margaret was very concerned about family conflict and wanted to prevent any legal battles over her estate. The no-contest clause effectively ended any hope my family members might have had of fighting the will's provisions. They could accept their modest bequests or risk losing everything in a legal challenge they were unlikely to win, especially given the psychological evaluation and the clear evidence of Grandma's careful planning. Mr. Martinez handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandma's familiar script. "Your grandmother asked me to give this to you personally. She said it would explain everything you needed to know about her decisions and her hopes for how you would use your inheritance." My hands were trembling as I accepted the envelope, the weight of it seeming disproportionate to its size. Inside this simple piece of paper were Grandma's final words to me, her explanation for a decision that had just changed my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. The meeting concluded with Mr. Martinez providing contact information for Margaret's financial advisor and scheduling follow-up appointments to handle the legal transfer of assets. As we filed out of the conference room, the family dynamics had shifted so dramatically that it felt like we were completely different people than the ones who had walked in an hour earlier. Uncle Robert stopped me at the elevator, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. "Sarah, I hope you understand what you're doing. That money should be supporting the entire family, helping with Michael's student loans, Jessica's business expansion, Linda's medical bills. Keeping it all for yourself is selfish and goes against everything our family stands for." I looked at him steadily, feeling a strength I had never experienced before. "Uncle Robert, I haven't even decided what I'm going to do with the inheritance yet, but I do know that Grandma made her decision based on years of watching how each of us treated her and each other. Maybe instead of being angry with me, you should think about why she felt I was the right choice." Aunt Linda had been eavesdropping on our conversation, and she stepped forward with tears of frustration in her eyes. "You have no idea what kind of pressure this puts on the rest of us, Sarah. We've been counting on that inheritance to help with retirement planning, to pay off mortgages, to secure our children's futures. This isn't just about you anymore." The sense of entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. They had all been making financial plans based on money that had never belonged to them, counting inheritance chickens before they hatched, and now they were angry that their assumptions had been wrong. "I'm sorry you're disappointed," I said honestly, "but those were your assumptions, not Grandma's promises. She never told any of you that you would inherit substantial amounts of money." Jessica, who had been unusually quiet during the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Sarah, we're family. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Are you really going to keep millions of dollars while the rest of us struggle with ordinary financial pressures?" The irony of being lectured about family loyalty by people who had treated me as an afterthought for years was not lost on me. These were the same relatives who had forgotten my birthday for the past 3 years, who had never invited me to holiday gatherings unless Grandma specifically requested it, who had openly mocked my career choices and living situation. "I need time to process all of this," I said finally. "This isn't a decision I'm going to make in a parking lot an hour after finding out about it." As I drove home to my small apartment, my mind was reeling with the magnitude of what had just happened. The envelope from Grandma sat on my passenger seat, waiting to be opened when I could give it the attention it deserved. The familiar streets of Portland looked different somehow, as if the entire world had shifted while I was sitting in that conference room. My phone began buzzing with text messages almost immediately. Michael asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss family financial planning. Jessica suggesting we hire a financial advisor together to maximize the benefit for everyone. Uncle Robert demanding that I call him immediately to discuss responsible stewardship of the inheritance. I turned off my phone and drove in silence, needing space to think without the pressure of family expectations weighing on every thought. The small apartment I shared with Alex had never looked more welcoming, its modest furnishings and second-hand decorations suddenly seeming like symbols of a simpler time, when my biggest financial worry was whether we could afford to eat out once a week. Alex was waiting for me when I walked through the door, having left work early after I texted about the will reading. One look at my face told them that the afternoon had not gone as anyone expected. "How bad was it?" Alex asked, wrapping me in a hug that felt like coming home after a long and difficult journey. "It wasn't bad," I said slowly, still struggling to find words for what had happened. "It was impossible. Completely, utterly impossible." I told Alex everything, from the shocking inheritance amount to the family's reaction to the envelope I was now afraid to open. We sat on our second-hand couch, holding hands while I tried to process the reality that my financial situation had changed so dramatically that I was now wealthier than all of my family members combined. "She must have had her reasons," Alex said thoughtfully. "Your grandmother was one of the smartest people I ever met. She wouldn't have made this decision lightly." That was true. Grandma Maggie had been incredibly thoughtful about everything she did, from the way she organized her spice cabinet to the careful consideration she gave before offering advice. If she had chosen to leave me her entire estate, she had thought long and hard about that decision and its implications. "I think I need to read her letter," I said, looking at the envelope that had been sitting on our coffee table since I arrived home. "Whatever she wanted to tell me, I need to hear it before I make any decisions about what comes next." Alex squeezed my hand encouragingly. "I'll be right here when you're ready to talk about it." I opened the envelope carefully, unfolding several sheets of paper covered with Grandma's distinctive handwriting. Her words seemed to speak directly to my heart, as if she were sitting beside me on the couch, sharing one final conversation over tea and homemade cookies. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you know about the inheritance and you're probably feeling overwhelmed. I want you to understand why I made the choices I did, and what I hope you will do with the resources I'm leaving you." The letter went on to explain how she had received word of her brother Heinrich's death 12 years earlier, along with the shocking news that he had left her his entire estate. Heinrich had been a successful private banker in Zurich, never married, and had maintained careful investment portfolios that had grown substantially over the decades. "I chose not to tell the family about the inheritance for several reasons," Grandma's letter continued. "First, because I wanted to observe how each of you treated me when you believed I had nothing to offer but my company. Second, because I remembered how money had torn apart Heinrich's relationship with our other siblings when our parents died. And third, because I wanted the freedom to live my life on my own terms without family members suddenly becoming very interested in my welfare." She wrote about watching Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda over the years, noting how their visits became less frequent as their own financial situations improved, how they seemed to view her as a burden rather than a person worthy of respect and attention. She described her disappointment in Michael and Jessica, who had grown into adults who measured success purely in monetary terms and showed little interest in family relationships that didn't benefit them directly. "But you, my dear Sarah," the letter continued, "you visited me because you enjoyed my company. You listened to my stories not because you felt obligated, but because you found them interesting. You helped me with errands and appointments, not because you expected something in return, but because you cared about my well-being. You chose a career helping children, not because it was financially rewarding, but because you wanted to make a difference in people's lives." Tears were streaming down my face as I read her words, recognizing the validation I had craved for years from family members who had never seen my choices as valuable or worthwhile. "The money I'm leaving you is not just an inheritance," Grandma wrote. "It's a tool to help you continue the work that brings you joy, and to support the causes that matter to you." Heinrich used his wealth to help refugees during World War II, providing safe passage and new identities for people fleeing persecution. "I hope you will find your own way to use these resources to help people who need it most." The letter concluded with specific information about the Swiss bank account where the majority of her wealth was held, along with contact information for her financial advisors and detailed instructions about accessing the funds. She had even included a separate document outlining her suggestions for charitable giving and investment strategies, though she made it clear that all decisions were entirely up to me. "Remember, dear Sarah, that true wealth comes from the love we share and the good we do in the world. Money is simply a means to make those things possible. Use it wisely, use it generously, and never let it change who you are at heart." By the time I finished reading, I was crying so hard that Alex had moved closer to hold me while I processed the magnitude of what Grandma had entrusted to me. This wasn't just about money. It was about carrying on a legacy of using resources to help others, about proving worthy of the faith she had placed in me, about honoring the values she had tried to instill in our entire family. My phone had been buzzing intermittently with more messages from family members, but I ignored them, while I absorbed the weight of Grandma's expectations and hopes. She had given me not just financial security, but a responsibility to use that security in ways that would make the world a little bit better. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls with financial advisors, meetings with Mr. Martinez to begin the legal transfer process, and increasingly desperate attempts by my family members to influence my decisions about the inheritance. Uncle Robert showed up at my apartment unannounced, insisting that we needed to have a, quote, serious family discussion about how to handle what he called our grandmother's estate. Aunt Linda left voicemails alternating between guilt trips about family loyalty and thinly veiled threats about the consequences of selfish behavior. Michael sent me lengthy emails outlining investment strategies and suggesting that I hire him as a financial consultant to manage the inheritance. Jessica stopped by my workplace, cornering me in the parking lot to propose that we pool our resources to start a family real estate development company. Each interaction reinforced Grandma's assessment of their characters and her wisdom in choosing not to share her wealth with people who saw it primarily as an opportunity for personal gain. None of them asked how I was handling the emotional impact of her death. None of them expressed interest in understanding why she had made her decision. All of their energy was focused on finding ways to access money they had never earned and never been promised. The most difficult conversation came when Uncle Robert demanded a family meeting at Grandma's house, ostensibly to divide her personal belongings, but really to make one final attempt at changing my mind about the inheritance distribution. We gathered in her living room on a Saturday afternoon, the modest furniture and familiar decorations now carrying the additional weight of being part of a multi-million-dollar estate. Uncle Robert had prepared what appeared to be a formal presentation about family financial planning and responsible wealth management. "Sarah," he began, his tone attempting to strike a balance between authority and persuasion, "I think you need to understand the position this inheritance puts our entire family in. We're not asking you to give up everything, just to share it in a way that reflects our grandmother's love for all of us." Aunt Linda nodded emphatically, her eyes red from what appeared to be genuine tears. "Sarah, honey, your grandmother loved all of us equally. She would never have wanted to create this kind of division in the family. You have to know that." But I was beginning to understand that Grandma had known exactly what she was doing. The division in our family hadn't been created by her will. It had been revealed by it. The greed and entitlement I was witnessing had always been there, hidden beneath surface politeness and family obligations. "I think Grandma knew our family better than we realized," I said quietly. "And I think she made her decision based on that knowledge." Michael leaned forward, his expression serious and concerned. "Sarah, we're worried about you. This kind of sudden wealth can be overwhelming for someone without experience managing large sums of money. We're not trying to take advantage of you. We're trying to help you avoid making mistakes that could cost you everything." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, the same tone he had used when explaining why my career in social work was financially impractical. They still saw me as the naive family member who needed their guidance and protection, unable to conceive that Grandma might have chosen me precisely because of qualities they had always dismissed as weaknesses. "I appreciate your concern," I replied, "but I'm going to take time to make thoughtful decisions about how to handle this responsibility. Grandma trusted me with her legacy, and I intend to honor that trust." Jessica's composure finally cracked, her voice rising with frustration and desperation. "This isn't just about money, Sarah. This is about fairness and family and doing what's right. How can you justify keeping millions of dollars while your own family struggles with ordinary expenses?" The accusation of selfishness hung in the air, but I found myself thinking about Grandma's letter and her brother Heinrich, who had used his wealth to save lives during one of history's darkest periods. I thought about the children in foster care I worked with every day, who needed advocates and resources to build better futures. I thought about Mrs. Helen Parker, who would never have to worry about affording her medications or heating her home. "I can justify it," I said finally, "because it's what Grandma wanted. And because I trust that she knew what she was doing when she made this decision." The meeting ended with no resolution and considerable family tension. As my relatives gathered their things to leave, Uncle Robert made one final attempt at persuasion, his voice carrying a note of warning that sent chills down my spine. Sarah, I hope you realize that actions have consequences. If you're determined to keep that inheritance to yourself, you shouldn't expect the family to just accept it and move on. We've all been hurt by this situation, and hurt people don't always make rational decisions. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and I realized that my journey from family disappointment to unexpected heiress was far from over. The real test of Grandma's faith in me was just beginning, and I would need every bit of strength and wisdom she had tried to instill in me to navigate the challenges ahead. The threatening undertone in Uncle Robert's voice followed me home that evening, settling into my thoughts like an unwelcome guest. Alex noticed my distracted mood immediately, finding me staring out our kitchen window at nothing in particular while dinner grew cold on the stove. "They're not going to let this go, are they?" Alex asked gently, wrapping their arms around me from behind. I leaned back against their warmth, drawing comfort from the one relationship in my life that remained unchanged by Grandma's revelation. "No, I don't think they are. Uncle Robert made it pretty clear that there would be consequences if I don't share the inheritance." Over the following weeks, those consequences began to manifest in ways both subtle and overt. My cousin Michael started posting on social media about family loyalty and the importance of supporting relatives during difficult times, with pointed comments about people who forget where they come from when fortune smiles upon them. Jessica began spreading rumors through her real estate network about my supposed financial irresponsibility, suggesting that I was squandering Grandma's legacy on frivolous purchases. The harassment escalated when Aunt Linda contacted my supervisor at the county social services office, expressing quote, stability following Grandma's death, and questioning whether someone dealing with such significant personal issues should be responsible for vulnerable children. The complaint was baseless and quickly dismissed, but it demonstrated how far my family was willing to go to pressure me into sharing the inheritance. More troubling were the legal maneuvers that began appearing. Uncle Robert hired a different attorney to explore options for contesting the will despite the no contest clause, arguing that Grandma had been unduly influenced or mentally incompetent when she made her final decisions. While Mr. Martinez assured me that such challenges were unlikely to succeed given the extensive documentation of Grandma's mental competency, the mere existence of the legal threat created stress and uncertainty. Meanwhile, I was working with Grandma's financial advisors to understand the full scope of the inheritance she had left me. The Swiss bank account alone contained over $2 million in carefully diversified investments, while additional accounts held another $2 million in various securities and bonds. The house and personal property added approximately $300,000 to the total, creating a net worth that still seemed surreal every time I saw the numbers on paper. Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, the financial advisor who had worked with Grandma for over a decade, became my guide through the complexities of managing such substantial wealth. A sharp woman in her 60s with silver hair and keen eyes, she had clearly respected Grandma's intelligence and shared her values about responsible stewardship of resources. "Your grandmother was one of my most thoughtful clients," Dr. Hoffman explained during our first meeting in her downtown office. "She never made impulsive decisions, always considered the long-term implications of every investment, and was genuinely concerned about using her wealth to benefit others. She spoke about you often, Sarah, and she was confident that you would carry on that tradition." Under Dr. Hoffman's guidance, I began to understand the investment strategies that had grown Heinrich's initial inheritance into such a substantial sum. Grandma had been remarkably sophisticated in her financial planning, diversifying across international markets, supporting sustainable energy companies, and consistently reinvesting dividends, rather than spending them on personal luxuries. She lived on approximately $40,000 per year, Dr. Hoffman revealed, which came primarily from Social Security and your grandfather's pension. She never touched the inheritance money for personal expenses, viewing it as a trust to be preserved and grown for future generations. This revelation helped explain Grandma's modest lifestyle, despite her hidden wealth. She had genuinely lived within her means, using coupons and shopping sales not because she had to, but because she chose to maintain the values and habits that had served her well throughout her life. As I learned more about Grandma's financial philosophy, I also began researching the charitable causes she had supported quietly over the years. Through Dr. Hoffman, I discovered that Grandma had been anonymously funding scholarships for refugee children, supporting a local food bank, and contributing to international relief organizations working in Switzerland and other European countries affected by conflict and displacement. She never wanted recognition for her giving, Dr. Hoffman explained. She believed that charity should be about helping others, not about making the donor feel important or generous. That's another reason she was so private about her wealth. Inspired by Grandma's example, I began developing my own plans for the inheritance. My work in social services had shown me countless needs that could be addressed with adequate funding. From supporting aging-out foster youth to providing emergency assistance for families in crisis. The more I learned about effective philanthropy, the more excited I became about the possibilities for making a meaningful difference. However, my family's harassment campaign was intensifying. Uncle Robert began showing up at my workplace uninvited, cornering me in the parking lot to deliver lectures about family responsibility and the moral obligation to share good fortune. His visits were becoming frequent enough that my colleagues started noticing, and I could see the concern in their eyes when they witnessed his aggressive behavior. The situation reached a crisis point when I arrived home one evening to find my apartment door slightly ajar and clear signs that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing, but my personal papers had been rifled through, and my laptop showed evidence of being accessed. The violation of my privacy was deeply unsettling, but even more concerning was the message it sent about how far my family was willing to go to find leverage against me. I called the police to file a report, though I had no direct proof of who had broken in. Officer Janet Rodriguez, a patient woman who specialized in domestic disputes, took my statement and listened carefully as I explained the family situation and the escalating harassment I had been experiencing. Unfortunately, proving family harassment can be difficult, Officer Rodriguez explained, unless someone threatens you directly or you have evidence of who broke into your apartment. Our options are limited. But I want you to start documenting everything. Keep records of every phone call, every unwanted visit, every social media post. If this escalates further, you'll need that evidence. Taking her advice, I began keeping a detailed log of every interaction with my family members. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. What had begun as disappointment and pressure had evolved into systematic intimidation, designed to wear down my resistance and force me to capitulate to their demands. Alex suggested that we consider hiring private security, but I was reluctant to live in fear of my own relatives. Instead, I decided to take a more proactive approach. If my family wanted to escalate their campaign against me, I would respond by accelerating my own plans for the inheritance. I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Martinez to discuss establishing a charitable foundation in Grandma's name, something that would make it legally impossible for me to simply distribute the money to family members even if I wanted to. The foundation would support causes Grandma had cared about, while also funding new initiatives focused on child welfare and refugee assistance. That's an excellent idea, Mr. Martinez agreed when I outlined my plans. A charitable foundation would provide tax benefits, ensure that the money is used for worthy purposes, and create a lasting legacy that honors your grandmother's values. It would also make it much more difficult for anyone to claim that you're misusing the inheritance for personal gain. As we worked on the legal framework for the foundation, I also began reaching out to Mrs. Helen Parker, who had become an unexpected ally in understanding Grandma's true intentions. Helen had been receiving her own harassment from my family members, who seemed to believe that she might have influenced Grandma's decisions or had access to additional information about hidden assets. Your grandmother saw this coming, Helen told me during one of our regular tea visits in her cozy living room. She knew exactly how Robert and Linda would react, and she was prepared for them to make your life difficult. That's why she was so careful about the legal protections, and why she chose someone with your strength of character to handle the responsibility. Helen shared stories about conversations she and Grandma had shared during their bridge games, revealing how carefully Grandma had observed her family's behavior over the years. She had been particularly hurt by Michael's casual dismissal of her opinions and Jessica's obvious boredom during family gatherings. But she had been most disappointed by her own children's increasing distance as they became more successful in their careers. She used to say that prosperity reveals character, Helen recalled. Your uncle and aunt became more selfish as they accumulated wealth, while you became more generous despite having less. That told her everything she needed to know about who should be trusted with serious resources. Armed with this understanding of Grandma's reasoning, I felt more confident about proceeding with the foundation plans, despite the ongoing family pressure. Dr. Hoffman helped me structure the initial funding and investment strategies, while Mr. Martinez handled the legal requirements and tax implications. The foundation's mission statement reflected Grandma's values and interests, supporting educational opportunities for disadvantaged children, providing assistance to refugees and immigrants, funding research into sustainable development, and supporting programs that strengthened family and community bonds. I named it the Margaret Thompson Foundation for Human Dignity, ensuring that her legacy would be remembered in connection with causes she had genuinely cared about. When I announced the foundation's creation to my family during what I intended to be our final group conversation, their reactions confirmed everything Grandma had understood about their true motivations. Uncle Robert was furious that I was throwing away money on strangers instead of supporting family members, while Aunt Linda accused me of trying to buy a reputation for generosity with money that rightfully belonged to all of us. Michael's response was perhaps the most revealing. He suggested that I was being manipulated by, quote, liberal guilt, and questioned whether helping refugees and foster children was really the best use of resources that could be supporting American family members instead. His casual dismissal of the very people Grandma had spent years helping anonymously showed how completely he had missed the point of her life's work. Jessica's reaction was more calculating. She proposed that the family could work together to manage the foundation, with each of us taking leadership roles in different areas of giving. When I explained that the foundation's board would include independent community leaders and philanthropy experts rather than family members, she accused me of shutting them out of decisions that affected their inheritance. The confrontation ended with Uncle Robert delivering another thinly veiled threat, this time suggesting that my selfish and irresponsible handling of the inheritance might force the family to take more serious action to protect Grandma's legacy from being wasted. The menace in his voice was unmistakable, and I realized that my battle with my family was far from over. However, I was no longer the uncertain and overwhelmed young woman who had sat in Mr. Martinez's office just months earlier. Grandma's trust in me, combined with the support of people like Alex, Helen, and Dr. Hoffman, had given me the strength to stand firm against intimidation and manipulation. I was beginning to understand that honoring Grandma's legacy meant more than just managing her money responsibly. It meant proving that her assessment of my character had been correct, even when facing the worst behavior from people who were supposed to love and support me. The foundation paperwork was filed within the week, officially establishing the legal structure that would govern how Grandma's inheritance was used. For the first time since learning about the Swiss bank account, I felt like I was moving forward with purpose, rather than simply reacting to family pressure. Grandma had given me not just money, but the opportunity to make a lasting difference in the world. I was determined to prove worthy of both gifts, no matter what obstacles my relatives placed in my path. The phone call came at 3 a.m, jolting me from deep sleep with its shrill urgency. Alex stirred beside me as I fumbled for the receiver, my heart already racing with the kind of dread that comes from unexpected middle-of-the-night communications. "Sarah, thank God you answered." The voice belonged to Mrs. Helen Parker, but she sounded shaken in a way I had never heard before. "I'm at the hospital. Someone broke into my house tonight, and I think it's connected to everything that's been happening with your family." I was fully awake instantly, Alex sitting up beside me as they heard the alarm in my voice. "Helen, are you hurt? What happened?" "I'm mostly fine, just some bruises where I fell trying to get to the phone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But Sarah, they didn't take anything valuable. They went through my papers, my address book, anything that might have information about your grandmother. The police think they were looking for something specific." The implication hit me like a physical blow. My family's harassment had escalated beyond targeting me directly to threatening an innocent elderly woman whose only crime had been friendship with Grandma Maggie. The violation felt personal and dangerous in a way that made my hands shake as I gripped the phone. Alex was already getting dressed, understanding without words that we needed to get to the hospital immediately. During the drive through Portland's empty early morning streets, I tried to process how far my relatives were willing to go in their pursuit of what they considered their rightful inheritance. Helen was in the emergency room, sporting a nasty bruise on her cheek and scratches on her arms from her fall, but otherwise alert and determined. When she saw me, her expression shifted from relief to worry. Sarah dear, I'm so sorry to drag you into this, but I think they're looking for something that doesn't exist. The person who broke in kept asking about papers your grandmother might have left with me, documents about overseas accounts or investments. They seemed to think Margaret had hidden additional money that wasn't included in the will. The absurdity of the situation was almost overwhelming. Not only were my family members unwilling to accept the inheritance distribution Grandma had carefully planned, they were now convinced that there were additional hidden assets they could claim if they could just find the right paperwork. Officer Rodriguez, the same police officer who had taken my break-in report, arrived to interview Helen about the attack. When she learned about the connection to my family situation, her expression grew grim. "Mrs. Mitchell, this has moved beyond family disputes into criminal territory. Whoever did this committed breaking and entering, assault on an elderly person, and possibly intimidation of a witness. We need to take this seriously." I provided Officer Rodriguez with the detailed log I had been keeping of my family's harassment, watching her eyebrows raise as she read through weeks of documented intimidation, threats, and increasingly aggressive behavior. The pattern was clear enough that even a busy police officer could see the escalation toward violence. "I'm going to recommend that you consider requesting restraining orders against the family members who have been most aggressive," Officer Rodriguez suggested. "This kind of behavior typically gets worse before it gets better, and Mrs. Parker's attack suggests they're willing to target anyone they perceive as being connected to the inheritance." Helen was released from the hospital that morning with instructions to rest and monitor for signs of concussion, but she insisted on going home rather than staying with relatives in another state. Alex and I spent the day helping her secure her house and install a security system, while I grappled with the guilt of knowing that her attack was connected to my inheritance. "This isn't your fault, dear," Helen said firmly when I tried to apologize for the trouble my situation had brought into her life. "Your grandmother knew this might happen. That's why she was so careful about the legal protections and why she chose someone with your moral strength to handle these resources. Don't let their bad behavior make you doubt her wisdom." Over the following days, the investigation into Helen's attack yielded results that confirmed our suspicions. Security cameras from a nearby business had captured footage of Michael's Porsche in Helen's neighborhood around the time of the break-in, while phone records showed that he had been in contact with a private investigator who specialized in asset searches. When confronted with this evidence, Michael hired his own attorney and claimed that he was only trying to ensure that all of Grandma's assets had been properly identified and included in the estate. He insisted that the break-in was coincidental and that his presence in Helen's neighborhood was innocent, though he couldn't provide a convincing explanation for why he had been there at 3 a.m. The private investigator, when questioned by police, revealed that Michael had hired him to search for evidence of additional overseas accounts or hidden investments that might not have been disclosed in the will. The investigator claimed he had advised against any illegal activities, but admitted that Michael had been increasingly desperate to find assets that could be claimed by the family. This revelation prompted Mr. Martinez to take more aggressive action to protect both the inheritance and my personal safety. He filed for restraining orders against Uncle Robert, Aunt Linda, and Michael, citing the pattern of harassment, the attack on Helen, and the evidence of illegal asset searches. The restraining order hearings were held in family court, the same building where Grandma's will had been read months earlier. This time, however, I was not the overwhelmed and uncertain beneficiary sitting quietly while others made decisions about my future. I had become someone willing to fight for the legacy Grandma had entrusted to me and for the safety of people who supported that mission. Judge Patricia Hawkins, a stern woman with gray hair and penetrating eyes, reviewed the evidence with the thoroughness of someone who had seen too many family disputes escalate into dangerous territory. The documentation I had compiled, combined with the police reports about Helen's attack and the private investigator's admissions, painted a clear picture of systematic intimidation and escalating threats. Uncle Robert's attorney attempted to portray the family's behavior as understandable grief reactions and legitimate concerns about estate management, but Judge Hawkins was not persuaded by arguments that minimized the seriousness of threatening an elderly woman and conducting illegal searches. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Hawkins addressed my uncle directly, "your mother made clear and legally sound decisions about her estate distribution, Your disagreement with those decisions does not give you the right to harass, intimidate, or threaten anyone connected to the estate or its beneficiaries. The restraining orders were granted, prohibiting Uncle Robert, Aunt Linda, and Michael from contacting me directly, coming within 500 feet of my home or workplace, or attempting to contact anyone connected to the estate administration. Violations would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. Jessica, who had not been directly implicated in the more serious harassment, was not included in the restraining orders. But she received a stern warning from Judge Hawkins about the consequences of continuing any intimidation campaigns against me or my supporters. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of vindication and protection that had been missing since the inheritance had been revealed. However, I also understood that legal documents were only as effective as people's willingness to respect them, and my family had already demonstrated a troubling disregard for boundaries and consequences. Dr. Hoffman had been monitoring the situation closely, and she arranged a meeting to discuss additional security measures for both my personal safety and the Foundation's operations. Her experience with other high-net-worth clients had taught her that family conflicts over money could become surprisingly dangerous when substantial amounts were involved. Unfortunately, we've seen this pattern before, Dr. Hoffman explained during our meeting in her secure downtown office. Family members who feel entitled to inherited wealth sometimes escalate their behavior when legal channels don't produce the results they want. We need to be prepared for the possibility that the restraining orders won't stop them completely. Under her guidance, I hired a personal security consultant who specialized in protecting individuals facing family-based threats. The consultant, a former police detective named Marcus Thompson, no relation to my family, conducted a comprehensive threat assessment that included recommendations for home security, workplace safety protocols, and personal protection measures. The most dangerous period is typically the first few months after legal action has been taken, Marcus explained during our initial consultation. Restraining orders can either diffuse the situation or escalate it, depending on the personalities involved. Based on what you've told me about your family's behavior patterns, I'd recommend being extra cautious for the next several weeks. Meanwhile, the Margaret Thompson Foundation was beginning its actual charitable work, providing a positive focus amid the family drama. Our first major initiative was establishing scholarship funds for aging-out foster youth, something that drew directly from my professional experience and Grandma's passion for helping vulnerable young people. Working with my colleagues at the County Social Services Office, we identified dozens of deserving recipients who needed financial support to pursue higher education or vocational training. The joy on their faces when they learned about the scholarships reminded me why Grandma had trusted me with her resources, and why the Foundation's work was worth fighting for despite family opposition. Helen, who had recovered physically from her attack but remained understandably shaken by the experience, became one of the Foundation's first volunteer advisors. Her decades of experience with charitable organizations and her understanding of Grandma's values made her perspective invaluable as we developed programs and policies. "Your grandmother would be so proud of what you're building," Helen told me during one of our planning meetings in the Foundation's newly established office space. She always said that money was most powerful when it created opportunities for people who wouldn't otherwise have them. However, the relative calm that followed the restraining orders proved to be temporary. Jessica, who had avoided legal consequences but clearly felt excluded from any benefit from the inheritance, began a more subtle campaign designed to undermine the Foundation's reputation and my credibility as its director. She used her connections in the real estate and business communities to spread rumors about financial mismanagement, suggesting that I was using charitable donations for personal expenses or failing to properly oversee the Foundation's investments. While these accusations were completely false and easily disproven, they created enough doubt and confusion to potentially damage the Foundation's ability to attract additional donors and community partners. More concerning were the anonymous tips that began appearing to tax authorities and charity oversight organizations, alleging various violations of nonprofit regulations, and suggesting that the Foundation was being used as a tax avoidance scheme rather than a legitimate charitable organization. Each allegation required time and resources to investigate and refute, diverting energy from the Foundation's actual mission. Mr. Martinez worked closely with the foundation's legal team to address each challenge systematically, but the pattern of harassment was clear. My family had shifted from direct intimidation to attempting to destroy the foundation itself, apparently reasoning that if they couldn't access the inheritance directly, they could at least prevent it from being used for purposes they disagreed with. The stress of defending both myself and the foundation while trying to maintain my regular job responsibilities was taking a toll that I tried to hide from Alex and Helen, but the weight of constant vigilance and legal battles was becoming exhausting. Some mornings I woke up wondering if Grandma had really understood what she was asking of me when she left me responsible for her legacy. Those doubts typically faded when I saw the impact the foundation was already having. Letters from scholarship recipients describing how the financial support had changed their educational prospects. Reports from refugee assistance programs about families who had received critical help during their resettlement process. And feedback from community organizations that had received grants to expand their services to vulnerable populations. Each success story reinforced my determination to protect what Grandma had built, and to ensure that her vision of using wealth to create opportunities for others would continue despite the obstacles my family placed in the way. The battle was far from over, but I was no longer fighting just for myself. I was fighting for every person whose life could be improved by the resources Grandma had carefully preserved and strategically deployed through the foundation she had inspired me to create. 5 years later, I stood in the Margaret Thompson Foundation's headquarters, watching our newest scholarship recipients receive their awards. The young woman at the podium, Maria Santos, had aged out of foster care with nothing but determination and a dream of becoming a nurse. Now she was graduating nursing school debt-free, thanks to Grandma's legacy. "This scholarship didn't just pay for my education," Maria said, her voice strong with emotion. "It gave me hope when I thought nobody cared about kids like me. It showed me that there are people who believe we're worth investing in." Alex squeezed my hand as tears blurred my vision. This was what Grandma had envisioned when she entrusted me with her fortune. Not family members fighting over scraps, but real lives transformed by strategic generosity. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. We'd funded over 400 scholarships, helped 150 refugee families resettle successfully, and supported dozens of community programs. The Swiss inheritance that had once seemed like an impossible burden had become a source of immense purpose and joy. My family's harassment had gradually diminished as the restraining orders held, and their legal challenges repeatedly failed. Uncle Robert had eventually declared bankruptcy after spending his retirement savings on feudal court battles. Aunt Linda had moved to Arizona to live with distant relatives, still bitter, but finally silent. Michael faced criminal charges for the break-in that hurt Helen, receiving 2 years probation and community service. Only Jessica had found some measure of peace, eventually approaching me through Mr. Martinez to apologize for her role in the family's behavior. She'd started volunteering at a homeless shelter, she said, and finally understood what Grandma had tried to teach us about true wealth. "I was so focused on the money that I never saw the person," Jessica admitted during our careful reconciliation meeting. "Grandma deserved better from all of us." Helen, now 86 and still volunteering despite her ordeal, had become the foundation's most beloved ambassador. Her attack had actually strengthened her resolve to honor Grandma's memory, and she often spoke at our events about the importance of choosing generosity over greed. Dr. Hoffman continued managing the foundation's investments with the same wisdom Grandma had valued, ensuring that our charitable work could continue indefinitely. The original inheritance had actually grown under her careful stewardship, proving that doing good and doing well weren't mutually exclusive. Standing in that auditorium, watching young people who reminded me of my former foster care clients accepting opportunities that would change their lives forever, I finally understood the full scope of Grandma's gift. She hadn't just left me money, she'd given me the chance to discover who I really was when tested by both wealth and adversity. The family that had once dismissed me as a failure now watched from a distance as the foundation earned recognition for its innovative programs. Awards lined our office walls. But the real measure of success walked across graduation stages, started new businesses, and built families and communities around the world. That evening, Alex and I visited Grandma's grave for the first time in months. Her simple headstone bore the inscription she'd requested. She planted seeds of kindness everywhere she went. Fresh flowers from Helen's garden decorated the plot, and I could almost hear Grandma's voice in the evening breeze. "You were right about everything," I whispered to the gathering darkness. "About family, about money, about what really matters. Thank you for trusting me with your dreams." As we walked back to our car, my phone buzzed with a message from Maria, the nursing student who'd spoken at the ceremony. "Thank you for believing in me, Mrs. Mitchell. I start my job at Children's Hospital next week. I'm going to help kids the way your grandmother helped people her whole life." I smiled, understanding finally that Grandma's Swiss bank account had never really been about the money at all. It had been about something far more valuable: the power of one person's faith in another to create ripples of goodness that would outlast us all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.